Understanding segments of a circle. Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's new topic, let's take a quick moment to reflect on what we have already learned. In our previous lesson, we explored the concept of a sector. You might remember that a sector is essentially a pie slice shape, which always originates from the center of the circle and is bounded by two radii. Now, while sectors are very important, they aren't the only way to divide a circle. Today, we are going to shift our focus to a different part of the circular region, known as the segment. Over the next few slides, we will look at how a segment is formed and how it differs from the sectors we studied previously. What is a segment of a circle? Now that we've recalled what a sector is, that classic pie slice from the center, let's dive into our main topic for today. What exactly is a segment of a circle? To define it precisely, a segment is a specific region within a circle that is bounded by two geometric components, a chord and an arc. To make sure we have a solid foundation, let's break these two components down individually. First, we have the chord. Think of a chord as a straight line segment where both endpoints sit exactly on the circumference of the circle. It's a straight path cutting through the circle's interior. Second, we have the arc, which is simply a portion of the circle's outer edge or its circumference. Now, here is the key concept to remember. The moment you draw a chord across a circle, you are effectively dividing the entire circular area into two distinct, separate parts. Each of these two resulting parts is what we call a segment. As we move to the next slide, we will look at how we classify these two parts based on their size. Types of segments. Now that we understand that a chord divides a circle into two distinct parts, we need to learn how to name them. Depending on the size of the region created by that chord, we classify segments into two specific types, the minor segment and the major segment. First, let's look at the minor segment. As the name minor suggests, this is the smaller of the two regions created by the chord. If you look at the area enclosed specifically between the chord and the shorter part of the circumference, which we call the minor arc, that is your minor segment. On the other hand, we have the major segment. This refers to the larger of the two regions. It is the area enclosed between the chord and the longer part of the circumference, known as the major arc. So, just remember, the smaller piece is the minor segment, and the larger piece is the major segment. In the next slide, I'll clarify a very important rule regarding how these terms are used in your textbooks. Important note on terminology. Now, before we move on to some practical examples, I want to highlight a very important tip regarding mathematical terminology. As we just discussed in the previous slide, a single chord actually divides a circle into two different areas, the minor and the major segments. However, you will often notice in your textbooks or during exams that a question might simply say, find the area of the segment, without specifying if it is the minor or the major one. In these cases, you can breathe a sigh of relief, because by convention, mathematicians assume we are talking about the minor segment. So, unless the problem explicitly mentions the major segment, you should default to calculating the smaller region. Real-world example, the pizza cut. Now, I know that geometric definitions can sometimes feel a bit abstract, so let's move away from the textbook for a moment and use a real-world example to help you visualize what we've just discussed. Imagine you have a large, delicious, circular pizza sitting right in front of you. Now, think back to our previous lesson on sectors. Usually when we eat pizza, we cut a traditional slice from the center all the way to the edge. That's a sector. But for this scenario, I want you to imagine something different. Instead of cutting from the center, imagine you take your pizza cutter and make a single, straight cut across just one small side of the pizza without ever touching the center. Let's break down what has happened to our pizza using the terms we just learned. First, look at that straight line where your knife passed through the pizza. That straight cut represents the chord. Next, look at the curved outer crust of that small piece you just separated. That curved edge is what we call the arc. Now, look at the small, crescent-shaped piece of pizza that you've cut off. Because this is the smaller of the two regions created by our cut, we call this the minor segment. Finally, look at the large portion of the pizza that is still left on the tray. Since this is the larger area, this is the major segment. By using this pizza analogy, you can clearly see how a chord divides a circle into two distinct parts. In our next slide, we will look at some common mistakes to avoid, so keep this pizza image in your mind to help you distinguish between a segment and a sector. Common mistakes to avoid. Now, before we wrap up our lesson with the key takeaways, I want to pause and address a very common pitfall. I often see students getting confused between the two concepts we've discussed so far, sectors and segments. To ensure you don't lose marks on /TextExams$, let's look at how to clearly distinguish them. First, let's compare the sector versus the segment. Remember our discussion from the very first slide? A sector is essentially a pie slice. It is bounded by two radii and an arc, meaning it must always involve the center point of the circle. On the other hand, as we learned in slide 2, a segment is bounded by a chord and an arc. You can think of a segment as looking more like a bow, and unlike a sector, it does not necessarily involve the center of the circle at all. Next, be careful not to confuse the arcs themselves. When you are working through a problem, always ensure you are identifying the minor arc when dealing with the minor segment and the major arc when dealing with the major segment. One final special case to keep in mind: if that chord we've been talking about happens to pass directly through the center, meaning the chord is a diameter, the circle is divided into two perfectly equal segments. In this specific instance, we call these segments semicircles. Keep these distinctions in mind as we move to our final summary slide. Key takeaways. First, remember the fundamental definition. A segment is simply the region of a circle that is enclosed between a chord and its corresponding arc. As we discussed when looking at the different types of segments, we have two categories. The minor segment is the smaller of the two regions, bounded by the minor arc. On the other hand, the major segment is the larger region, bounded by the major arc. A very important tip for your exams: if you encounter a problem that just uses the word segment without specifying minor or major, you should assume the text is referring to the minor segment. Finally, to prevent the common mistake we touched on earlier, always remember the visual difference between a sector and a segment. A sector is center-based, meaning it is formed by two radii and an arc, much like a slice of pie. However, a segment is chord-based, meaning it is formed by a chord and an arc, and it does not necessarily involve the center of the circle. All right, we have reached the end of our lesson, so let's quickly recap the key takeaways to ensure everything is clear before we move on. If you have mastered these distinctions, you are well on your way to mastering circle geometry. Great job today!